Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought, the podcast where we unpack what's really moving the global automotive market and why it matters. I'm your host, Guido Vildozo. Today we're looking ahead at 2027 through the lens of OEM strategies. At a time when demand is constrained, affordability is calling the shots, and competition is getting sharper by the quarter. The core tension is simple. Households are still stretched, vehicle prices remain high, and the market is more volatile and more regional than it's been in years. Meanwhile, the competitive bar is moving. Faster development cycles, lower cost structures, the bigger questions about who owns the tech stack. To dig into what this means in practice, I have the honor of being joined today by Thomas Meininger, who authored our 2027 Automotive Industry Outlook on how OEMs can stay competitive. Thomas, welcome. Thank you for being here. On a personal note, I'm delighted to have this exchange with you today.
Absolutely. Same on my side. So Guido, thank you very much for having me, for inviting me for this podcast. Really looking forward to it. So exciting topic. And I'm happy to catch up with you, talking cars, talking industry. We go back so many years. So it's always great to have a discussion with you. I look forward to it.
Absolutely. Let me put you on the spot right away, Thomas. When you step back, what's the main storyline for OEMs heading into 2027?
Yeah, good question to kick us off, Guido. So there's so much going on at the moment. Quite interesting times, not easy times. But what we can see is that, first of all, OEMs are caught between suppressed demand. I would say there are some affordability issues out there. We will talk a bit more about that later. But then on the other side, we have a hyper competitive and very volatile market. So we have a lot of new players coming to market, a lot of Chinese OEM players, also talking a bit more about that later on. So it's that suppressed demand, a lot of competition, volatility. And then the other 2 points I would mention is regional divergence. If you think back, and you know that very well, a couple of years back, there was that idea of having one size fits all, the global vehicle, the global platform, and everything working out smoothly. That is over, right? So we got North America in one direction, Europe in another direction, China in a very different direction. Now, China increasingly impacting its key export regions. If you think Southeast Asia, Middle East, South America, again, increasingly impacted by Chinese players there. So regional divergence is a huge thing. And on top of all of that, we think for 27, profitability remains under pressure. So the industry-wide EBIT margins are expected to stay clearly below pre-pandemic levels. And this is quite a lot to swallow for the OEMs and for the industry going into 27.
Ticking time bomb, if you ask me, Thomas, but we'll see more on that later. And let's focus a little bit on the consumer for the time being, Joe Smith or Dieter Schmidt, if you so wish to call it. Are we looking at the late purchases? Are we trading downwards to smaller segments? Or are people just completely exiting the new car market at this point in time? What are you saying from your perspective?
So a mixture of it. So we really see that people at the point of purchase, they're looking at it and they're seeing higher prices, both in terms of MSRP and transaction prices. They see higher interest rates translating into inflated monthly payments, whether it's financing or leasing. So it starts to translate into the market, and the customers need to react to it. And some of them look for, I would say, the better value for money option. So the old brand loyalty, this is really at risk at the moment, because now more and more customers look for alternative ways where they get the best bang for the buck, right? So looking for value for money, as mentioned. And some are just, really waiting and keeping their used vehicle for longer, or not coming to the new vehicle market. Interestingly, in that connection, I think is the current popularity of of the hybrid vehicles, both in the US and in Europe. And I think this is a direct result of it, because from what we see, consumers on both sides of the ocean see it as financially a very sound compromise. They see it as immediate fuel savings without these upfront investments that you have on electric vehicles, which comes at a price premium. So that is definitely what we're seeing, making smart choices, making very deliberate choices, but looking for good value for money. That's certainly something we see.
You just mentioned hybrids, Thomas, and what role do you expect hybrids to play in 2027? Is this a bridge technology? Is it is it here to stay? Is it a temporary spike? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, that's a great point. We're doing so much work at the moment. There's so much interest from our perspective, and also from all the feedback that we're getting, talking to OEMs and industry players. It's far more than a temporary spike. We believe it becomes the mainstream OEM default. So kind of the base option, the base offering for Utah kind of started then. So what I believe the base option is then full hybrid. Honda followed. Hyundai, Kia is now looking into that, and now a lot of other OEMs, especially on the volume or the mass side, are looking into exactly the same thing. So depending on how long you define bridge, the bridge can be very, very long. Potentially, we could see it as a bridge technology, but it's definitely here to stay. Again, it becomes the default. Again, as I mentioned before, very good fuel efficiency. You do not have a high front cost. So from the consumer side of things, it checks the boxes. Also from the OEM side, it checks those boxes because it helps meet their emission regulations, wherever that applies. While they can still generate revenue, they're still making very decent profits and revenues with full hybrids, especially where they can control the costs as compared to the BEVs, for example. So consumers appreciate them, OEMs appreciate them. And what we are now beginning to see from a model policy perspective is that we're seeing an expansion in the portfolio and the model policy offerings of these full hybrids. They used to be more at the entry of the pack, at the entry volume part of the portfolio, and now they're reaching up to the upper position with higher power. Smart full hybrids is another interesting thing, like Honda came up with that thing. So if you think of that back, Guido, to it when OEMs tried to package a lot of these smart features with battery electric vehicles, now they take some of these smart features and package it together with full hybrids, for example. So it's definitely not anymore the case that the electric vehicles get all the nice ADAS feature, infotainment features, and so on. No, this is really trickling down full hybrids as well. And we see that particularly. So,
Absolutely, no questions asked, and hybrid is the premium trim at this point of time, stateside. Thomas, no questions asked. Let's shift a little bit here. And anecdotally, as you know, I'm originally from Bolivia, South America. Was recently spending time with my parents. And one of the things that I am noticing is the abundance of BEVs. And they're primarily Chinese. And you'll address this in just a little bit more. But the main driver was price. However, the input getting from some of these drivers, whether it's an Uber driver or whatever the case may be, is particularly for us where elevation is a component of the equation. One of the cities is at 13,000 feet, 3,600 meters. If we translate to the other side of the scale, oxygen density is 55% of what we have at sea level. Instant torque. So they're discovering that BEVs have that instant torque, and that's a major advantage relative to everyone else. Amazing how quickly, and also hearing this from the dealers, how sales have essentially grown fourfold over the last 3 years within the region because of pricing and so on and so forth. But obviously, that's not the case in the Northern Hemisphere. That's not the case in the US and Europe. So let's talk a little bit about that. What has to be true for EV demand to hold up in 2027 without having to rely on that cash on the hood?
The cash on the hood is definitely, let's start with that, the incentives, right? Because what we've seen, talking about Europe, for example, whenever we had incentives in place, the market performed very, very well. So whether it was BVs or plug-in hybrids, that was definitely there. But we all agree that cannot last forever. It must be a self-sustained market and at some point. And this is coming back to your question, what has to hold true? Well, first of all, obviously charging infrastructure. I don't want to, it's almost so obvious that I don't want to stay too long on it, but for example, the comeback that Tesla seems to have at the moment is partially connected to that because they own their charging infrastructure. You don't need to worry about charging infrastructure there. It just works, which is not necessarily the case for the others. So that is one. That there must be further investment on that side. But certainly also on the model policy side. So we need to see a wider variety of especially affordable electric vehicles in the segments where people actually buy them. So we know that particularly in the US and in Europe, the electrification, battery electrification started to top down. It started top down. It started when in the higher segments, expensive price points and so on. And now it starts to trickle down. And we do see that happening. And to be honest, it might be actually a good thing that all of that competition with Chinese OEMs, Tesla, is there, because I believe it's pushing Western OEMs to bring better product, to maybe even bring them earlier than originally intended, because the competition is just there. It's so strong and they need to move. And all of the vehicles that we see, or a lot of the electric vehicles we're seeing at the moment are very appealing. They're much better than phase one or even phase two electric vehicles. So we're seeing a lot of improvement there. The last point, Guido, I would like to mention is residual value or resale value. Because as you know, that has been a big bottleneck or a big hurdle. Especially that first wave of electric vehicles suffered a lot in terms of residuals. And everybody who had to bear the risk, whether it was the OEM, the captive banks, the consumers themselves, they now realize, not so good. So stabilizing that residual value will be a very, very critical point so that it's on par with the combustion vehicles. So this is another thing to look into, I believe.
Absolutely. And anecdotally, Thomas, talking to some of the dealers, they've highlighted and they said, each OEM promised me a $25,000 BEV. What they did not tell me was that it was going to be used. So it's certainly happening right now as we speak. But let's talk about our partners. If you're a global OEM, where do you still push for growth and where do you shift in this defense mode? Let me reword it even a little bit further. I remember having a conversation with one of the heads of sales for one of the OEMs in the US, and he said, the resources are limited. Obviously, I want to push in all of the brands, but I have to pick one brand. So what should our partners do, Thomas? Where should they basically push at this point in time?
I mean, down a question, and it's true. Everybody keeps telling us the budgets are limited. So where do you focus on? First of all, I think push where there's a real customer demand, which is on the hybrid side, as we discussed earlier. This is not driven by regulators or legislation and so on. There's a real customer interest in it. And so I think OEMs do well in going into that direction. Also into some more affordable BEVs, maybe not so much on the US side, but certainly from a more international perspective, that makes sense because the market is there and it will be growing. I know that a lot of OEMs are looking at emerging markets for growth. The problem is these are exactly the markets that the Chinese are targeting as well with their export ambitions. So this will be a bit of a trickier one. To your question about the defense mode, where do you defend your market? I would certainly see in North America the legacy, the Detroit Three descending their home turf. So they're bigger, full size and large trucks and SUVs. This is where they make the money, and they need to defend that because we see so many other OEMs coming into the market, localizing, especially the Asian OEMs, also the European OEMs coming with dedicated product built in the US for the US market, also trying to want to have a piece of that cake. And so that gets the Detroit 3 in a defense mode. The other place of the world, which is purely in defense mode, is China for basically every foreign OEM. It's just defense mode, right? If you think of it, um, you can just try to protect what's left there. And even that will not be easy. You need to localize your operations. You need these deep partnerships with Chinese companies, and even export some of that knowledge, export some of these vehicles out of China. So initially it used to be in China for China. Now we see more in China for global, not from the Chinese OEMs, but from Western OEMs. But China is a very, quite concerning market and is purely in defensive mode for our global OEMs.
On that note, how should European OEMs balance out CO2 compliance with pricing power when the Chinese competition is pushing the market downwards? I'm impressed, Thomas, at the number of model offerings and obviously slightly different regulatory requirements to import them into Latin America. But the 9,900 is very real in some of these vehicles, and they have capacity for 4 passengers, which sort of goes back to where you started. This is what we were pursuing with some of these global vehicles. The Logan was supposed to push for some of that, and so on and so forth. So how can the European OEMs balance that out? Because obviously you're losing money on many of the BEVs. So you're hit on either end. You're hit on the fines, but you're also hit on the build of the vehicle. What process is on that when the Chinese are not suffering similar pain points?
That's a huge discussion here. And although we have now tariffs in place, they really do not change the pattern. We see Chinese OEMs continue to be very, very aggressive. We see cases of 10,000 euro incentives paid by the OEM. It's really all about gaining market share and gaining traction into the market. And it's very tricky because regulation demands more battery electrification. There's no way around it. But at the same time, we all need to acknowledge that China is leading in terms of technology, in terms of value chain, which means indirectly that improves the market position of the Chinese versus the home market OEMs, right? So again, we need that electrification, but electrification they have the advantage. The Chinese definitely have the advantage on that type of things. And there is a lot of lobbying work happening, as you can imagine, a lot of discussions in Brussels taking place and so on. But I think at the end of the day, still what the legacy European OEMs must do, they need to be able to compete for cost or at least improve their relative positioning. Remember, a lot of the Chinese OEMs now have to localize in Europe sooner or later. So their cost position might also change, at least slightly, because now they produce here. And a lot of the European OEMs do everything that they can to reduce costs at the moment. So that might not be on par, but they're pushing in the right direction. Strategic partnerships is also another thing. We see more and more of them to share the cost burden, to accelerate the development. But interestingly, these partnerships are often between Western OEMs and their Chinese OEMs, OEM partners. So this is something that is happening. But I would argue that in all of that, my recommendation would be that the legacy Western OEMs must continue or should leverage their strengths like perceived quality, their dealer network, the service network, the residuals, all of that. Because if they purely try to compete in terms of product, in terms of the number of screens or tech gadgets in the vehicle or on cost, that would be a very, very hard battle. So they need to improve on the one side, on the cost side, on speed, on agility, but the same side, I would definitely say they need to pay a lot of attention to what made them strong and to keep that quality up in the future.
Thomas, let's bring you back to my home turf, land of red, white, and blue. And what does a winning portfolio look like in the US for 2027? Given affordability and given the competitive landscape, where would you place your efforts if you were in one of the OEMs today?
It has to be localized, right? Because there's so many uncertainties. USMCA discussions about to kick off soon. From what I understand, you know that much better than I do, but there's uncertainty. I think this is one of the big risks in our forecast at the moment. If that whole negotiation goes sideways and there's additional cost burden coming to vehicle production and so on. So you want to localize, and this is what we're seeing at the moment. A lot of localization push. Product weighted towards hybrids. Talked about it a couple of times before, but also renewed focus on combustion offerings, which wasn't in the cards before, but now we see more and more development on that side. And then with that, of course, focus on your popular and profitable segments, the SUVs, the trucks. And as we mentioned before, try to defend them, because my impression, if we take a step back, is that a lot of OEMs look at the US as a safe haven. Europe is struggling. China is struggling, or for some of them even lost, and some of these emerging markets are hard to tap into. So you have the US market. And a lot of brands, we researched that a lot in our OEM strategy reports. They look at North America and the US specifically as that growth outlook where they have profits and so on and so forth. The problem is, if every OEM does the same thing, it means the market will be even more cluttered. There will be more competitive pressure. There might be pressure on pricing and so on, because the market is not really growing. The TID is quite stable. It's not where it used to be. In the US market, we have quite a lot of headwinds. So it's not an easy win, I would definitely say. So some OEMs make it sound a bit easier than it is in reality.
Absolutely. It's and I do want to highlight where you started off, Thomas. Sold in the US, but also built in the US is going to be a key milestone, because if we look at current trading partners as part of USMCA, one of the primary concerns is, if you look at Japan, if you look at Europe, yes, they have a tariff of 15%, but they have no regional value content requirement. Whereas us on our end, even if we keep the 15%, but with a 82 or a 85% RVC, at a location where most of the manufacturing is very expensive, be it Canada or the US, that puts a lot more pressure on affordability and obviously that winning portfolio and how you're going to navigate that. But let's talk about the guys that, are moving quickly. I remember on a occasion, Thomas, you and I, we were at a test center for new vehicles, and they were all cladded and so on and so forth. And we were 3, 4, 5 years out from seeing some of these vehicles hit the market. So yes, it was a privilege to see them and have that opportunity. But at the same time, it was a punishment, because you know that wasn't coming out anytime soon.
Yes.
So there are guys that now do it very quickly. They do it in 6 months, in 12 months. And let's talk about Chinese OEMs. How are they compressing these cycles? And what can these legacy players, the ones you and I visited before, do today to basically catch up with them?
That's a great question. And I understand that this is one of the huge remaining tasks of a lot of the colleagues on the strategic consulting side of things, that they advise all of these OEMs what to do and how to shorten their development cycles and so on and so forth. Again, I think it's a bit easier in theory said than done. I think what's really holding the legacy OEMs back is their own organizational structure, very hierarchical, siloed sometimes, operating sequence and not in parallel, a bit of that waterfall approach. So every step must be completed before the next kicks off and everything nice and clean. And I heard just recently that for almost every legacy Western OEM, during the testing phase, during development, you need to have at least 2 summer and 2 full winter cycles
Mhm.
for testing it. Which by definition means that's 2 years that just
Mhm.
go into testing, right? Chinese, on the other side, often don't do that. And for me, it's hard to grasp because some say they're cutting corners, they're sacrificing on quality and so on. I cannot judge it. Others say they're just more efficient. They go by first principles thinking and saying, hey, we don't need it. We do it differently. And just because you as a legacy OEM have been doing that way for 40, 50 years doesn't mean that it's the right thing. Maybe it's somewhere in between, right? But the fact, and we know that from talking to a lot of the legacy OEMs that you mentioned, from cutting down from first 60 months to 48 months. So I think this is already out there. But now going down from 4 years to 3 years, so 36 months, this comes from top down. This comes from top management at some of the German OEMs, for example, for certain products. So yeah, what used to be 5 years now has to be done in 3 years and no excuses. This is really what they demand from their teams. So a lot of changes happening on that side. And hopefully we're seeing some improvement in speed and agility at the end of the day.
So, Thomas, let's take it from an engineering perspective because I completely agree with you. Lean and mean is the name of the game to me. But talking to some of the engineers, the pushback comes in and there's a question that normally comes in and it's if we simplify, we're run the risk of basically hurting the customer. It's exactly what you're saying. Radiator may be too small or, transmission box is going to heat up or something else like that would happen. What should they avoid cutting as they're looking at some of these measures? And not only referring to the technical side, because neither you and I are necessarily engineers, but from an overall big picture perspective, are there specific items that you would not touch?
100%, definitely. And this is tangible quality and reliability. This is it for me, because this is one of the USPs that the legacy Western OEMs still have, and they need to defend that at all costs. Now, unfortunately, we've seen in the past that a lot of decisions have been made potentially by the C office and more for financial reasons. Usually the criticism comes very, very quick and very hard, right? This is something that we have seen a lot, and luckily some OEMs start to pivot and go in a different direction. So again, tangible quality, reliability. There are certain things under the hood and things that customers don't see and so on. Yes, I get it, but you cannot save in the areas where the customer experiences it every day. That's number one. Second is safety. I think that's a given. It's also the regulation. You cannot cut corners there. And then the third one is speed and how intuitive the user interface is. Because let's face it, the vehicle will always be in a competition with your consumer electronics device. If it's your tablet or your cell phone or whatever it is, you will automatically compare the technology that you have on both sides. And if the automotive technology feels like it's generations behind, then this is a big problem. So that is the key touch point, that user interface that defines the vehicle's identity. It's for a lot of customers no longer the fit and finish, and if you have nice wood panels or how responsive your steering is or something like that. Luckily, there's still customers out there who appreciate that. That's great to see. But for more of them, they want to see that user interface working out. And this is where I would also not cut corners. Quality, safety, user interface. Those are the three things.
Completely agreed, and highlighting that, those high-tech vehicles with the fancy wood panels, they're normally leased. The consumer doesn't hold on to that, so it becomes someone else's problem. But let's, Thomas, when you and I started in this business, we had just gone through the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we were seeing from OEMs was basically a decoupling. We were moving to a modular world where you were outsourcing pieces to suppliers and you were trying to simplify the process. And the OEM was basically just focused on assembling the vehicle.
Yes.
Needless to say, there's a part of the world that is teaching us that maybe we now have to bring everything in-house.
Mhm.
So how should an OEM decide what to own versus partner for, particularly as we talk about the future, as everyone is ringing the bells of affordability, the next topic is robo-taxi and mobility as a
Yes.
service.
Yes.
So do we partner, do we not partner, for software, for computer, for ADAS? How do we navigate that risk?
That's a great question. And it's easy to get lost in that, I think, because we hear so much. And I think this is what you alluded to, vertical integration, right? Tesla is vertically integrated, BYD is vertically integrated. And then it would be easy to derive at the conclusion, we just do everything in-house and ourselves and then solves the problem. Well, maybe not. There are some things that are strategically important and other things you just don't have the bandwidth or the expertise to really be good at it. And usually some of the names I just mentioned that have the vertical integration, they focus on some things which they're really good at and have the best technology. They don't do everything in-house either, right? And so if you ask about these new technologies, software, and so on, connecting it to what I mentioned before, what OEMs should probably own is the software layers that create that unique customer experience, right? So the user interface, things that control driving dynamics, or maybe you have a signature ADAS behavior or something like that, that you consider signature to yourself. This is something that you should try to do in-house. But then you can partner for a lot of the underlying architecture, which is really differentiating, even the hardware side, base operating system, the cloud infrastructure, zonal architecture. Yeah, I get it. This is all important for the often quoted software-defined vehicle. But do the customers really tell the difference? Can they really tell the difference if you have a software-defined vehicle or not? At the end of the day, a lot of it is under the hood. A lot of it has to do with the wire harness and all of these things. I believe from my limited understanding, probably, this is where you can say if you don't need your own operating system. Even in the IT world, we do not have 30 different operating systems. We have a few big ones and they work very well. Cloud infrastructure and so on and so forth. Not everybody needs to do it. VW Rivian for me is the perfect example. Volkswagen try to do everything on their own, try to own the entire stack. Now it realizes it's not a smart idea, partnering with Rivian, and they acquire the whole framework. They acquire the zonal architecture, the software platform. Everything is coming from outside, and they focus more on fine-tuning it to their brand experience, but they don't build it from scratch anymore. So this is something I believe that we will see, and we have to see much more in the future.
Thomas, to wrap up and to sort of put you on the spot so that you can make friends, both good and bad, if you had one word of advice to OEM leadership of things that they're doing good and things that they're going bad for 2027 strategy, what would that be?
That's a good question. That's a tough question, of course, which is saved for the end for me, but no, it makes sense. So I think everybody needs to understand that traditional scale, traditional heritage no longer guarantees success. It's a thing of the past, right? So these new competitors that are fast moving in operating and so on, they set the scene, they set the stage, and you need to adopt to that. And on the other side, I would still say, and I mentioned it before, I would be not urge or advise legacy OEMs trying to compete with Chinese OEMs on the number of screens, the number of tech gadgets. That is a losing battle, I think. But combining some of these improvements in terms of efficiency, everything that we discussed earlier in terms of the organizational layout and so on, with their key strengths, the service, the quality, the network, reliability, and trying to be better on residuals. That is a strong one. And then the last one is forming more partnerships. I believe there's no way around it at the moment. We have a lot of these talks in the industry between OEMs to form partnerships. Oftentimes it's egos that are coming into the way, and these partnerships are not really forming, at least not how they're supposed to be. Maybe at some point the pressure is getting so high that they just have to do it in order to survive, make the best out of it. That's definitely another one that would be that I would advise and see into the industry. Yeah.
Thomas, what a privilege it has been to have you as our first guest under the new logo, Mobility Global. We couldn't have made a larger splash, I believe, than we have today. Any closing remarks, Thomas, from your perspective?
First of all, again, thank you very much for having me. It was really good catching up with you and going through that. I had a lot of fun also writing that thought leader piece or that article about 27. Of course, not only doing it myself, but also reaching out to a lot of my colleagues who contributed with their smart minds and good ideas to that. I hope it gives a bit of an insight into the work that we're doing day in, day out. We're not taking it lightly. The challenges are out there. They're really, really big. And again, we take it very seriously and we try everything that we can to support the industry with our insights and with our analysis. And yeah, Pierre.
Thomas, thank you so much. I think this outlook makes it very, very clear. 2027 is to be seized. Reward OEMs that build affordability into product, redesign cost structures structurally, making sure that quality is top-notch, not necessarily incremental, and make deliberate choices about tech ownership and partnerships.
Yeah.
Thank you again for joining us today and sharing such practical clarity. And to everyone listening in onto this month's Fuel for Thought, please follow us under our new name, Mobility Global, on LinkedIn for more market intelligence and strategic insight. We'll be back next month with another episode. Thank you.
Thank you.